On the morning of April 19, 1944, a German reconnaissance pilot flying low over the fields of southeast England turned his camera toward the military encampment sprawling beneath him. The light was thin and gray. Rain had softened the dirt roads. From 2,000 feet, the shapes were unmistakable. Rows of Sherman tanks clustered near canvas bivouacs, fuel trucks lined up along muddy access lanes, and heavy artillery pieces dug into revetments. The pilot clicked the shutter again and again. He banked north, throttle wide, and when he landed 90 minutes later across the channel, the film canisters were rushed to intelligence analysts in occupied France. By evening, the photographs were on a desk in Berlin. An officer circled the tank formations in red pencil. Someone wrote a single word in the margin: Patton. The tanks were made of rubber and canvas stretched over scaffolding frames. The trucks were wooden silhouettes. The artillery pieces were painted plywood. The entire encampment could be deflated, folded, and loaded onto 3 flatbed trucks in under an hour. But the Germans did not know that. What they knew was that General George S. Patton Jr. was in England. What they believed was that Patton would lead the invasion. What they feared was that wherever Patton struck, the war in the West would be decided. And so they waited. They fortified the wrong coastline. They held back their panzer divisions. They committed the most catastrophic intelligence failure of the Second World War. And it began with a photograph of equipment that did not exist. This is the story of Operation Fortitude South. It is the story of how the Allies built a phantom army, placed a volatile and brilliant general at its head, and used the enemy's own assumptions against them. It is a story about deception, yes, but also about belief, about what happens when a military machine built on discipline and doctrine becomes paralyzed by its own logic, about how fear can be planted, cultivated, and harvested like a crop, and about how the greatest weapon in war is sometimes not steel or fire, but the slow and patient distortion of reality itself. By the spring of 1944, the question facing the Allied High Command was not whether to invade Europe, but how to ensure that when the invasion came, it would not be met by the full weight of the German Wehrmacht. Before the beachheads could be secured, the English Channel was only 20 miles wide at its narrowest point, between Dover and Calais. It was the most logical place to launch an invasion. It was also the most obvious. Hitler and his generals knew it. Rommel knew it. Every fortification along the Atlantic Wall reflected that knowledge. The gun emplacements at Calais were deeper, the minefields denser, the troop concentrations heavier. If the Allies landed there, they would face prepared defenses and rapid reinforcement from panzer divisions, stationed less than a day's march inland. The coastline of Normandy, farther west, was less fortified, but also less convenient. It required a longer sea crossing, more complex logistics, and greater exposure to weather. Yet it was precisely that inconvenience that made it survivable. The plan that emerged was not simply to land at Normandy, but to make the Germans believe the landing at Normandy was a diversion, to convince them that the real invasion, the hammer blow that would determine the fate of Europe, would come later at Calais. And to make that lie credible, the Allies would have to construct an entire army that existed only in German minds. They called it the First United States Army Group, FUSAG, on paper. It consisted of 11 divisions, over 150,000 men, supported by hundreds of tanks, self-propelled guns, landing craft, and aircraft. It was headquartered in Kent and Sussex, the counties closest to Calais, and it was commanded by the one American general the Germans respected above all others, George S. Patton. Patton had defeated Rommel in North Africa. He had driven through Sicily with a speed and aggression that unnerved even his own superiors. He was brash, profane, ruthless, and theatrically confident. German intelligence had tracked his movements for years. They believed he was the Allies' finest battlefield commander. They believed, correctly, that he craved glory. They believed, logically, that such a man would be given the most important mission of the war. That belief was the foundation upon which the entire deception would be built. The physical construction of FUSAG began in January 1944. Engineers and special effects unit personnel, many of them recruited from film studios and stage production companies, moved into fields and dockyards across the southeast. They erected inflatable tanks, made of rubberized fabric that could be inflated with bicycle pumps. They built plywood artillery pieces painted with shadows to mimic dimension. They laid out dummy landing craft and harbors using timber frames and canvas coverings. They constructed fake oil storage depots using sewage pipes painted to look like fuel tanks. They hung laundry on lines between empty tents. They dug latrine trenches. They parked real jeeps near fake supply dumps to add texture to aerial photographs. Every detail was designed to survive scrutiny from 2,000 feet. But not closer. Radio traffic was constant. Operators transmitted messages 24 hours a day, simulating the communications pattern of a Corps-sized headquarters. They sent orders for fuel deliveries, medical supplies, ammunition requisitions, personnel transfers. They broadcast in clear text when appropriate and in cipher, when they wanted the Germans to work harder to believe what they intercept. They created fictional units with fictional commanders and gave them fictional histories. The traffic had rhythm, density, and mistakes. Real armies make mistakes. FUSAG had to make the same ones. Patton himself became part of the illusion. He appeared at inspections. He gave speeches to non-existent divisions. He attended social functions in London and was photographed entering buildings that housed FUSAG administrative offices. German spies, many of whom had been captured and turned by British counterintelligence in an operation, codenamed Double Cross, sent reports back to Berlin confirming Patton's presence, his mood, his apparent focus. Some of these agents were so trusted by their German handlers that their reports carried more weight than reconnaissance photographs. They described Patton as impatient, aggressive, fixated on Calais. They reported troop movements, equipment deliveries, shortages of specific supplies that suggested imminent action. Every report was carefully scripted by British intelligence officers, and every script was designed to deepen the lie. The deception worked because it aligned with what the Germans already believed. They believed the Allies would strike where the crossing was shortest. They believed Patton was too talented to be sidelined. They believed the Normandy landings, when they came on June 6th, were a feint. For weeks after D-Day, Hitler and the High Command held back critical reinforcements, convinced that the real invasion was still coming at Calais. The 15th Army, stationed near Pas-de-Calais, remained in position. Panzer divisions that could have smashed into the exposed flanks of the Normandy beachhead stayed in reserve, waiting for Patton. That delay bought the Allies time. Time to expand the beachhead. Time to bring ashore reinforcements, fuel, ammunition, vehicles. Time to survive. What made this deception different from others was not its scale, though it was vast, but its patience. The Allies did not try to trick the Germans into making one bad decision. They tried to trap them inside a framework of belief that would generate a cascade of bad decisions over months. They understood that the most effective lies are not the ones that contradict your enemy's assumptions, but the ones that confirm them. There was a can of American coffee found in a captured supply truck near Caen. 3 weeks after the invasion, it had been brewed by a mess sergeant attached to a unit that landed on Omaha Beach. The can was standard issue, olive drab, stenciled with codes that indicated it had been packed in a facility in New Jersey 8 months earlier. A German supply officer examined it and made a note in a logbook. The note survives in a French archive. It reads, "American logistics appear unlimited." That note was written by a man who had spent 2 years watching his own supply lines fray and collapse, who had seen rail yards bombed, fuel depots burned, convoys strafed, who knew that his own soldiers were down to half rations and that replacement parts for vehicles were being cannibalized from wrecks. And now he was looking at a can of coffee that had traveled 3,000 miles across an ocean patrolled by submarines, been offloaded under fire onto a contested beach, and distributed to a unit in combat, still hot. It was not the coffee that mattered. It was what the coffee represented. It was proof that the enemy could do things his own side could not, that the gap between intention and execution, which had grown so wide in the Wehrmacht, did not seem to exist on the other side. Patton never commanded FUSAG in battle because FUSAG never fought. When the Normandy invasion succeeded and the breakout began, Patton was given command of the Third Army, a real force. and he drove it across France with the speed and violence everyone expected. But the ghost army he had pretended to lead continued to haunt German planning for weeks. Reconnaissance flights still reported seeing equipment in Kent. Radio signals still pulsed from headquarters that no longer existed. The illusion outlived its usefulness, and still it persisted. Because dismantling a belief is harder than planting one. The soldiers who inflated the rubber tanks and transmitted the fake radio messages did not see themselves as heroes. They saw themselves as stagehands. They worked in fields far from the front, handling props, following scripts, repeating the same tasks day after day. They were told very little about the larger plan. Some of them guessed. Most did not. But their work, invisible and uncelebrated, changed the outcome of the war as much as any battle. They understood that wars are not only fought with bullets and bombs. They are fought with information, with perception, with the manipulation of what the enemy thinks he knows. There's a recording, made sometime in late May 1944, of a German intelligence briefing in occupied France. The audio quality is poor, captured on a wire recorder by a French resistance operative who had placed a microphone inside a ventilation shaft. The voices are muffled, but the words are clear enough. An officer is summarizing reports from agents in England. He mentions Patton 3 times. He mentions Calais 4 times. He mentions Normandy once, and only to dismiss it as a secondary target. At one point, another voice interrupts and asks whether it is possible that the intelligence is false. There is a long pause. Then the first officer replies. He says Patton would not be wasted on a deception. The entire briefing proceeds from that assumption. The possibility that Patton could be used as bait, that his reputation itself could be weaponized, does not seem to occur to them. They could not imagine that the Allies would take their best general and make him the face of a lie. That failure of imagination cost them the war in the West. After the war, captured German generals were interviewed by Allied intelligence officers. Many of them were asked about fortitude, about how long they believed FUSAG was real, about when they realized they had been deceived. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, who commanded German forces in the West, admitted that he had considered Normandy a diversion until mid-July, more than a month after the landings. He said, and this is documented in the interrogation transcripts held at the National Archives in London, "We believed Patton would come. We believed it until we could no longer afford to believe it." That sentence is perhaps the most concise summary of the entire operation. Belief in war is not a matter of truth. It is a matter of affordability. The Germans believed in FUSAG because the cost of disbelief, the possibility that they had stripped Calais of defenses for nothing, was too high to accept until the evidence became overwhelming. The rubber tanks were eventually packed away and stored in warehouses. Some were reused in later deceptions. Some were left to rot. A few ended up in museums. There is one on display at the Imperial War Museum in London, deflated and folded like a collapsed circus tent. Visitors walk past it without understanding what it represents. It is not dramatic. It does not gleam. It is a piece of painted canvas and a bicycle pump, but it held an entire Panzer army in place for 6 weeks. It bought time. Time, in June 1944, was the most valuable resource on Earth. Patton himself was never told the full extent of the deception. He knew he was part of a ruse, but he did not know how many resources had been devoted to it, or how completely the Germans had believed it. He resented being sidelined, even temporarily. He wrote letters to his wife complaining that he was being wasted. He paced and fumed and demanded action. His personality, his impatience, his rage at being held back, all of it was visible to German intelligence, and all of it made the deception more believable. The Allies had not simply used Patton's reputation. They had used his flaws, his need for glory, his lack of subtlety, his transparent hunger for command. They had turned his weaknesses into weapons. The coffee can appeared again, or one like it, in the hands of a German prisoner taken near Falaise in August 1944. He was 19 years old, conscripted 8 months earlier, and he had not eaten a full meal in 5 days. An American sergeant gave him the coffee, still hot, poured from a canteen. The prisoner drank it slowly, hands shaking. He later told an interpreter that he had expected the Americans to be exhausted, undersupplied, desperate. That was what the propaganda had promised. That was what his officers had told him. But the sergeant who gave him the coffee looked rested. His uniform was clean. His rifle was new. The trucks idling nearby were American-made, factory fresh, painted olive drab without a scratch. The prisoner said, and this is recorded in the after-action report filed by the interrogation unit, "I realized then that we had already lost." That moment, small and unremarkable, repeated itself 10,000 times across France in the summer of 1944. German soldiers encountered American abundance and understood, sometimes for the first time, that the war was not a contest of will or ideology. It was a contest of productive capacity, and they were on the losing side. Deception operations are fragile. They depend on the enemy doing what you expect them to do, believing what you expect them to believe, acting on information the way you hope they will act. A single intercepted message, a single captured agent who talks, a single reconnaissance pilot who notices that the shadows on the dummy tanks do not move with the sun. Any of these could collapse the entire structure. Fortitude South survived because the Allies understood their enemy. They understood that the Wehrmacht was not stupid. It was logical. It made decisions based on the best information available. The deception worked because the information it provided was not absurd. It was plausible. It fit the pattern. It confirmed what the Germans already suspected. And so they acted on it, confidently, repeatedly, until it was too late. There is a photograph, taken in early June 1944, of Patton standing in a field in Kent. He is wearing a polished helmet, hands on his hips, staring at something outside the frame. Behind him, barely visible, is the corner of an inflatable tank. The photograph was released to the press. It appeared in British and American newspapers. German intelligence almost certainly saw it. What they saw was Patton in the field, preparing for battle. What they did not see was the bicycle pump just outside the frame, or the crew of engineers waiting to deflate the tank as soon as the photographer left. The photograph was not a lie, exactly. Patton was there. The tank was there. But the meaning of the photograph, the story it seemed to tell, was entirely false. That gap between appearance and reality is where wars are won. By the time Patton took command of the Third Army in late July, the breakout from Normandy was already underway. The hedgerows had been cleared. The ports were being opened. Fuel and ammunition flowed inland in quantities that stunned even allied logisticians. Patton drove his divisions east and south with a speed that matched the German blitzkrieg of 1940. He moved so fast that supply lines struggled to keep up. But they did keep up, because behind Patton was an infrastructure of trucks, railheads, depots, tankers, repair shops, field hospitals, and communication networks that dwarfed anything the Wehrmacht had ever assembled. That infrastructure was not dramatic. It did not win individual battles, but it made those battles winnable. It turned tactical victories into strategic collapse. And it existed because the United States had spent 3 years building the capacity to fight a war. On the far side of an ocean without running out of anything, the Germans had known, abstractly, that American industrial production was vast. They had seen the numbers, but numbers are abstractions. What changed minds was not statistics but encounters. A can of coffee, a new rifle, a truck that started every time, a medic with morphine and sulfa powder, a pair of boots that did not fall apart after 2 weeks of marching. These things accumulated. They built a picture, and the picture was of an enemy that did not have to choose between fuel and ammunition, between feeding its soldiers and equipping them, between holding one front and collapsing another. The picture was of an enemy that could do everything at once, everywhere, indefinitely. That picture broke morale faster than any battle. Patton did not create FUSAG. He did not design the dummy tanks or write the radio scripts, but his presence made it believable. The Germans could imagine him preparing for the decisive blow. They could imagine him chafing under restraint, demanding action, gathering his forces. They could not imagine him being used as a decoy. That was the brilliance of the operation. It did not require the Germans to believe something outlandish. It required them to believe something obvious. And because it was obvious, they never questioned it. After the war, One of the German intelligence officers responsible for evaluating Allied intentions wrote a memoir. In it, he described the moment he learned that FUSAG had been a fabrication. He wrote, "I felt not anger, but admiration. We had been beaten by logic, not by trickery. The Allies had understood us better than we understood ourselves." That admission, coming from a professional intelligence officer trained to doubt and verify, reveals something essential about fortitude. It was not a trick. It was a mirror. It showed the Germans what they expected to see, and they saw it so clearly that they never looked for anything else. The inflatable tank that sits in the museum in London was used again after Fortitude. It was deployed in Operation Fortitude in March 1945, part of a deception plan meant to mislead the Germans about where the Rhine crossing would occur. By then, the war was nearly over. The Wehrmacht was collapsing. Supply lines had disintegrated, but the deception was still deployed, still effective, still tying down units that could have been used elsewhere. Even in defeat, the Germans remained vulnerable to their own logic. They still tried to predict Allied intentions based on rational analysis. They still believed that commanders like Patton would be used in predictable ways. And so the same techniques that worked in 1944 worked again in 1945. Not because the Germans were foolish, but because they were consistent. Patton died in December 1945 from injuries sustained in a car accident in Germany. He never fought another war, but the ghost army he commanded, the one that never existed, outlived him. The techniques pioneered in Fortitude were studied, refined, and used again in later conflicts. The understanding that perception could be shaped, that enemies could be made to see what you wanted them to see, became a permanent part of military doctrine. Deception was no longer seen as a sideshow. It was understood as a force multiplier, a way to turn limited resources into strategic advantage. The rubber tanks and wooden planes were props, but the idea behind them was a weapon. And that weapon did not become obsolete. There is something almost gentle about the way the deception unfolded. No one was killed by an inflatable tank. No one died because they believed a fake radio transmission. The violence came later, when the real invasion began, when men stormed beaches under machine gun fire and died in the surf. But the fake army saved lives. It kept German reinforcements away from Normandy long enough for the Allies to establish a foothold. It turned a battle that could have been a slaughter into a battle that could be won. The lives saved were real. The tanks were not. That inversion, that reversal of substance and shadow, is what makes Fortitude so unsettling. The fake became more powerful than the real. The lie became the truth that mattered. By the autumn of 1944, the German commanders who had been deceived were no longer in a position to change the outcome. Rommel was dead. Rundstedt had been relieved and then reinstated, but his influence was waning. Hitler was giving orders from Berlin that bore no relationship to conditions on the ground. The Wehrmacht was in retreat on every front. The Allies were advancing faster than their own supply lines. The war had entered its final phase, and the question was no longer whether Germany would lose, but how long the losing would take. Fortitude did not win the war, but it shortened the war. And in a conflict where every week meant tens of thousands of casualties, shortening mattered. The coffee can, or something like it, passed through many hands. A mess sergeant brewed it. A soldier drank it. A prisoner received it. A German officer noted it. A historian found the note decades later and included it in a dissertation that almost no one read. The can itself is gone, melted down or thrown away or buried in a landfill somewhere in France. But the record of its existence survives, and with it the memory of what it meant. It was proof that one side could move a commodity 3,000 miles and keep it hot. That one side had so much of everything that it could afford to be generous even to its enemies. That the gap between the two sides was not a gap of courage or skill, but of capacity. And capacity, in the end, was what decided the war. Patton's Ghost Army was never meant to last. It was designed to survive just long enough to matter. It did. The invasion succeeded. The beachhead held. The breakout happened. And somewhere in a field in Kent, a crew of engineers deflated the last of the rubber tanks, folded it into a crate, and loaded it onto a truck. The performance was over. The audience had believed every word. and the history that followed was shaped, in ways both large and small, by a lie so well told that it became indistinguishable from the truth.